What's up, everyone? Welcome to Open Minded. I am Pete, and with me is the lovely Courtney Adams. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So today we're going to ask the question, what is PTSD?
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
Like the interesting thing is the houses you see around you are all solar houses.
21st Century Fox has been holding talks to sell most of the company to Walt Disney.
So Courtney, first of all, would you consider yourself an expert in the field of mental health and PTSD, depression, anxiety, trauma, that sort of realm?
Well, no, I don't consider I'm not an expert. I have specialties. I consider myself a specialist, but I'm not an expert. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been doing therapy with people for over 5 years. But yeah.
Okay, so what did you study?
I went to the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. You don't have to put that in there. I went to the University of Alabama for my bachelor's degree in Birmingham. I got my bachelor's degree in social work, and I got my master's degree from University of Alabama in social work as well.
Nice.
And I'm licensed as a clinical social worker in the state of California.
Great. Well, I know, as you know, I served in the military, so a lot of people think that PTSD is exclusive to military members who have gone overseas, have fought in combat zones, or having flashbacks about, being at war. Is that accurate?
Are you asking, is that the only
Is that the only
form of
PTSD? Because I think that most people, when they think of PTSD, that's the first thing that pops up in their head.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think historically it's been kind of, I don't want to say advertised that way, but in a way it has. It was called shell shock. I don't know, back in the day, it was referred to as shell shock.
That's what they called it in World War I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we know a lot more about that now, but of course that's not the only form of PTSD. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but there's a lot more. There are many more forms of PTSD, and a lot of it actually comes from child abuse. My specialty is also with children and youth. I've worked with both adults and children, but my specialty is with people under the age of 18. So a lot of that, a lot of PTSD diagnoses come from with children, and children who were abused, either physically, sexually, emotionally, things like that. So no, the answer to your question is no. That's not the only form.
Well, do you know the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder? Because like I was saying before, that's the first thing that people think of usually is military members, but it sounds like when you break down the words, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think for a while that they stopped calling it a disorder and then they started doing it again, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward. Post-traumatic stress. You have stress after a traumatic episode. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that a lot of people consider, just associate that with the military, I mean, it makes sense because, like you said, the term has evolved from shell shock into post-traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that it happens a lot from children and from stressful and traumatic episodes from when people are very young.
Right. So, I mean, if you're talking about the word and breaking it down, or the diagnosis, which if you look up the DSM, diagnosis definition, which is kind of what you asked for initially in that question, I can't give that to you off the top of my head. We're going to have to look it up and, look at the DSM diagnosis because there's a lot to it. But breaking down the words, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's an anxiety disorder. So that's where the stress disorder comes from. It's part of the anxiety disorders category of the DSM. It's post-trauma. So typically, obviously, this is going to be after a traumatic incident. And typically the way that they describe the DSM describes a traumatic incident is either witnessing or being physically or mentally in jeopardy of losing your life. So this is why we saw it come about in shell shock, because there were soldiers who were obviously being faced with death, and they were watching their comrades and their brothers in arms, or whatever you want to call them. They were dying in front of them. There was massive casualties in those large wars. And so we started seeing people who were coming back from that, and they were having these anxiety disorders. So that's where it comes from. And typically the reason why I also say that it evolves with children, or you see a lot of those diagnoses with children, is because there are children being sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally and verbally abused. And those are considered extreme traumas, in the sense that when a kid is witnessing severe domestic violence, they're witnessing a parent being beaten or being tortured or being strangled. They're witnessing somebody being close to death. And there's that fear that they, or someone that they love, or somebody that they're watching is going to die. So that's where the trauma comes in, is it has to be linked with that now in the DSM in order for somebody to be have the PTSD criteria. There are certain criteria, and it has to be essentially you, the person, or someone that they're watching or that they care for, somebody that they're around experiencing a near death experience.
So can people have similar symptoms to PTSD but not specifically be categorized in as having PTSD? Because personally, I was in the military, and I was never deployed. I was never put in a position where I was in fear for my life or for anyone else's life. But I feel a lot of stress and anxiety that I think is rooted from my experience in the military. But because of that definition that you just told me, technically I wouldn't be considered to have PTSD because it doesn't line up with the criteria. Mm-hmm. So what would be like something that you would categorize me in, or other people in like a similar situation as me? Because I always thought that it was a very light form of PTSD, as opposed to like people who did actually get deployed and do have combat experience, and they have a much more severe version of PTSD. So,
well, we're talking about the American psychiatric field, where there's this entire book. I told you it's called the DSM. It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and that's how people are diagnosed. So there's, for any and all disorders, mental health, psychiatric disorders, there's a list of criteria. And if you don't meet each of those criteria exactly, then you won't, according to your clinician, you won't be diagnosed with that. So yes, there are many symptoms that cross over from various diagnoses. You just might be diagnosed with something else. And without assessing you fully, I wouldn't diagnose you.
Okay.
On your podcast. Or anyone else watching. You'd have to go see someone and be evaluated.
So what would be the importance of actually going, if you're feeling like you have some type of stress disorder, or you're feeling like high anxiety or depressed, like you were just saying, you wouldn't want to jump to any conclusions. Mm-hmm. What would be the proper process for somebody to actually get diagnosed with something like that? Because I've heard, I had a friend who was diagnosed as bipolar, and to me, he didn't seem bipolar. He wasn't on any type of medication, as from what I know. And it seemed like his doctor kind of like jumped to that conclusion because a previous doctor that he was seeing didn't say that, and then this one said, you're bipolar, but it wasn't really from like, it didn't seem like they did a full like proper diagnosis on this person. Like, does that happen a lot? Because don't be offended by this, but part of me doesn't really trust healthcare professionals to 100% because, you are trained in this field, but nobody's perfect. People might jump to certain conclusions because everybody's human. Everybody makes mistakes. I don't know where I was going with this question, but
Well, I think to answer whatever it is you're talking about, it's like when you go and you get tested for cancer or you're going to go into surgery, how many people will tell you to get a second opinion? So
yeah, that's true.
there's always that possibility. Every clinician's different. Every person's clinical impression, clinical judgment, all of those things will be slightly different. Granted, we have this very strict manual that tells us the criteria. Out of curiosity, was your friend over the age of 18 when he was diagnosed with bipolar or under?
No, he was 16, I believe, when he was diagnosed.
So with my experience, I've worked a lot with children, and I've also worked with very, very wonderful psychiatric doctors. There's a drastic, in my opinion only, there's a drastic overdiagnosis of bipolar in children.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole nother podcast in and of itself. But so I would encourage that person, if this person doesn't feel as if they are bipolar and they're not medicated for bipolar disorder, they could always go seek another opinion. I wouldn't recommend you doling out diagnoses and saying, oh, this person...
You're bipolar, you're bipolar, you're bipolar.
This person is my friend and they don't seem like they're bipolar. Because, as...
It's okay.
As we know, a person looks different at any point in time, which also makes diagnosing things a little bit more hairy, because you're not going to present the same way to the same clinician or the same, even especially different clinicians or different psychiatric professionals every day. We're different. And especially that's kind of the nature of things like bipolar and personality disorders and things like that. So opening up another can of worms.
Oh, yeah. That happens all the time on this podcast. So, we start talking about one thing, we go off on a tangent, but we always try to come back to...
I've seen the podcast.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that you're a fan. So, obviously, different generations deal with different experiences, but in general, I feel like the psychological effect that certain trauma has on people doesn't necessarily change over time, but the diagnosis changes. Kind of like what we were saying, it was originally called shell shock, then it was called PTSD. Mm-hmm. Do you know about what time period they actually started diagnosing people as having PTSD that weren't in war situations? When did they start looking into childhood trauma and the effects that has on somebody as they're maturing?
I don't know the year for that. We would have to look that up. I don't think that... you have to look at a lot of mental health knowledge is fairly recent. Homosexuality was considered a mental health diagnosis up until 60s or 70s. I could be drastically
I'm sure that there are still some
wrong,
people around who think that it is. I know that there are some crazy extremist politicians who still think that that there is treatment to stop somebody from being homosexual, that if they go through an intense type of therapy and withdrawals and trying to rewire the brain to not be a homosexual, even though it's a lot of other scientists and doctors have proven that it's personality. It's not. It's something that a lot of people would say that you're born as a homosexual. You're not. It's not a choice. So the fact that people that are in charge running our country still believe that kind of irks me, and it really makes me kind of feel ooh.
Yeah. So in 1980, the APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association, they added PTSD to the DSM, and that was the third version. Essentially that's when it came out as being encompassing a traumatic stressor as external to the person. So they started looking at all of those things that we were talking about. So, I mean, we still have people who are combat veterans or people in combat zones. There's obviously now we've incorporated natural disasters, abuse, sexual assault, so like rape. There's all those things that they now encompass because we're considering those traumatic events. Domestic violence is considered a traumatic event to children who are witnessing it because, of course, like I said before, you have a child, maybe 5 or 6, who's watching their mother or father or family member being beaten or tortured or strangled or raped, and those are traumatic experiences as well. So it's really kind of evolved from that since the 80s.
What about verbal abuse? What if like there are children who are witnessing their parents yelling at each other, fighting a lot in front of the child? Could that potentially lead to some type of PTSD in the child,
Certainly.
even if there's no physical harm?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So of course you kind of have to look at this as a they're going to look at it from the symptoms perspective, or the clinician will look at it from a symptoms perspective as what is this child or what is this person experiencing as symptoms. But when you think about, just with common sense, thinking about domestic violence, even just as because verbal, altercations can be considered as domestic violence, and verbal abuse, if it extends to the period where extends to the point where it's affecting the child, that's when it's considered abuse. And to answer your question, yes. Kind of lost what your question was, but
the question was
verbal assault, yes, can be considered traumatic, because if you think about it, you're a young child and you have 2 people who are supposed to be your safekeepers and your stability, and they're screaming at each other at the top of their lungs, and you have no idea kind of what's going on. You're not old enough to kind of say, oh, they're just fighting. You don't know the outcome, and as a child that can be very scary and feel very unsafe.
Yeah, definitely. I have one more kind of idea that's been floating around in my head about this, and I'm sure that you've noticed this as much as anybody else in this country, but America seems very divided on a lot of issues lately. I feel like maybe it's always been there, but it seems so extreme nowadays. Like when I watch the news and I watch the extreme leftists and the extreme rightists, and nobody can meet in the middle and like agree on anything. It's just like my team or bust. So obviously liberals and people on the left think that and believe that insulting somebody or it's even hard to think of something right now.
Like offending someone.
Yeah, offending somebody, insulting somebody, that could be taken as like an attack on them. And people are triggered very easily. People don't want to be singled out. People don't want to be disagreed with. Like you've heard that term, triggered, obviously. And then on the other side,
teenagers using them.
Oh yeah, and on the other side of the spectrum, everybody on the right thinks that those people are too much of wimps and they're snowflakes, and they need to, when I was a kid, we just beat the hell out of each other, and look at me, I turned out fine. So it's like nobody really seems to be meeting in the middle. It's either everything is an attack on me as a person, and I need to be aware, like everyone needs to be aware of like my feelings, and don't insult anybody, don't hurt anybody's feelings, or everybody needs to chill the hell out and stop being such a snowflake. So that being said, who's right and who's wrong in that? Is there a middle ground? Because somebody who might feel like they have PTSD or have been through some type of drama, I know there are plenty of people out there who would probably say like, oh come on, just suck it up, just don't worry, don't worry about that. Don't think about it. Like, stop being such a wimp, or, and then on the other, like I said, on the other side of the spectrum, people would be crying at the tiniest little thing that might not even be traumatic. They might just perceive it as traumatic because their feelings get hurt. So, which side is right in that instance?
Well, I mean, it's like a no-win question there. So I think you just have differing opinions. It's kind of from the dawn of man. We've had people who just don't agree, people who don't see things the same way. I think it's interesting because you have younger people, these millennials who are being called snowflakes and stop whining. And by the older generation, or, when we were your age, we were, getting beaten by our parents and we were tough and we were fighting wars and all of that, which everyone has their own experience and they have their own perception of that experience. I think that the interesting thing is that you have young people now who are more educated. They're becoming more educated. More people are going to college. We have this breadth of knowledge with technology at our children's fingertips. We also tend to think that people might be coming with that knowledge, becoming more self-aware and more insightful into their feelings and being able to express things easier, which might lead to that, you're just crying about everything. To answer the question, I think there's a time and there's a place for everything. I think there's also balance. Not a super astrological person, and that doesn't really come into like a clinical conversation, but personally, I'm a Libra. I believe in balance, and I think that that's just a little bit of what people might be needing, is just a little bit of balance. If you want to express yourself and you want to feel heard, I think there's a way and a place to do it. Some people will never receive you in the way that you want to be received. Mm-hmm. The older generation may not feel that we're tough enough or we are like them enough. And again, that comes with, everyone's perception and a little bit of balance and a little bit of acceptance, a little bit of understanding all the way around. But I don't think that there's an answer to the question, because I don't think anyone is really right in that scenario. I think it just becomes a personal journey of acceptance and understanding and really being able to get along with others and know the right time and place for certain things. And
nice. All right, cool. So if anybody, anybody who's watching or listening, if they feel like they're having stress due to a traumatic episode in their life, if they feel like maybe they can relate to one of the things that we've been talking about today, what is your suggestion for them? What should they do? Who should they seek help from?
Well, I think if anyone in the audience is watching or listening that's having any sort of difficulty, I think obviously many people have to go to some sort of healthcare provider if you're wanting to go the route of a clinical assistance, the assistance of even just a therapist or a psychiatrist. It just kind of depends on what insurance you have, and unfortunately all of that stuff plays a factor in it. 211, dialing 211 from any phone, cell phone, landline, that's always probably my best resource, because people may be listening that aren't in California or are in another country. I don't think 211 exists in other countries, but or simply going on the web and looking things up. NAMI is a great organization. That's the National Association of Mental Illness. There's tons of resources online for finding things. That's a good website to start if you're kind of wanting to learn about things, or if you're experiencing symptoms. If they're really severe, you want to go to the emergency room. You want to go, get the recommendation or the referral from your pediatrician, is for kids, your doctor, or, if you don't have anyone to talk to a friend, talk to an adult, find somebody, a counselor, find somebody that you can talk to, or if you're religious, somebody at the church, just finding someone you can trust. And then also just making sure that if there's an emergency, you seek that appropriate help. Yeah.
Awesome.
Those would be my suggestions.
Thank you so much for being on the show today and giving us this very valuable information. We hope to have you on again soon someday. And if you guys at home have any questions or comments or concerns, leave a comment down below or email us at openmindedepisodes@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.